The series is meant to help inform our focus area worker members or FOG members about various technologies and policies being considered as a way to help decarbonize peak electric demand in Massachusetts. This series is for information only. It does not necessarily represent the positions of the FOG, the advisory board, or the state, but instead is meant to help provide sufficient information to FOG members so we're all working from a similar level of background information as we go into phases 2 and 3 in our decarbonizing the peak FOG, where we'll be assessing and recommending alternatives to fossil fuel powered peaker plants. So today's presentation is on the topic of surplus interconnection service. This is something that JERA Americas has been advocating for more education and information around. So we worked with JERA to help put together the panel we have here today to talk more about it. So thank you to JERA for your help with that. So we'll be starting off with a presentation from American Clean Power, followed by a presentation from Environmental League of Massachusetts, and ending with Long Road Energy and JERA. Each presentation or talk will be about 20 minutes long with 10 minutes saved for questions. Please enter your questions into the Q&A feature in Zoom. All the questions that are entered will be visible by the panelists you see here today, but I will ask the questions to the panelists at the end of each presentation. So with that, I will want to get us started, so I'll hand it over to Ba to present.
Share the screen here. Can you see the screen by any chance?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay. Very good. Okay. So, well, thank you also very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to discuss surplus interconnection service. My name is Ba Sirig. I'm the Senior Director of Markets and Transmission for the American Clean Power Association. So I just want to start giving off just a general definition of what surplus interconnection service is. So it basically allows a new generating facility to use the unused capacity of an existing facility at the same interconnection point. So let me explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. So if you're a new resource and you want to interconnect to the grid and access the transmission system or the highway system, your additional output is going to add stress to the current infrastructure, right? And so in order to avoid having a traffic jam, that's sort of the best analogy I can use, you as the new generator, to accommodate that new output, have to expand the existing highway and add another lane for a little bit of distance, right? And in order to determine what you have to do specifically, how much you have to widen the lane by, and what the distance of that new lane is going to be, you have to go through an interconnection study that's done by the grid operator, and that can take 5 to 7 years, and not to mention the cost associated with having to build that new infrastructure, that new lane on the highway. It can cost anywhere from, for every 100 megawatt resource you build, anywhere from 10 to 60 million, and it's usually on the higher end of that range. The issue with surplus interconnection service is there are a lot of resources that, either because of operational constraints or economic constraints, don't use that extra lane for a lot of hours of the year, right? And so for many hours of the year, that lane is completely empty. And so I'll give you an example. The first example is due to an economic constraint. Let's say in example 1, you have this old thermal resource. It paid for the interconnection service, but it's aging. It has a high heat rate. Fuel costs, such as oil, are really expensive. And so it's going to be priced out of the market for a majority of the year. So for 8,000 hours out of the 8760 hours of the year, it's just going to remain dormant, right? It's just not going to do anything, right? For 8,000 hours of the year, this lane is completely empty, right? And so one of the best ways to use that existing infrastructure in an optimal fashion is to pair that old resource with a new resource. So to have that developer, right, for instance, use battery storage, right, to charge from the grid during non-peak times, and then charge during peak times to make more use of that lane that would otherwise remain empty. The other example is an operational constraint. So you have a solar facility, and if it's rated at 1 megawatt, it's probably going to use up that highway system, that extra lane, for about 2,000 hours of the year. The remaining 6,700 hours of the year, it's going to be completely empty, right? Because the sun doesn't always shine to its maximum irradiance during the day, and it doesn't obviously shine in the evening times, right? So the best thing to do is to pair that with a battery, right? So what the battery would do is that it would charge in the middle of the day when demand is fairly low and the output of solar is fairly high, and then in the evening it would discharge during the ramp when solar kicks off the system but demand is increasing. So in recognition of surplus interconnection service, what happened was FERC in Order 845, they said, okay, well, all your RTOs, you're going to have to provide some sort of expedient process to process these service interconnection requests, right? The surplus capacity, because this, in a sense, the highway system is not being fully utilized, right? So you have to go outside of the current interconnection process, which can take several years, and you have to allow resources that want to use the same developer that wants to use that same existing interconnection point. You have to allow the developer to go through a quick process, and it doesn't have to pay for the new interconnection costs, and you can get that highway full of energy again, that highway lane full of energy again. So there are case studies that we have in terms of how successful surplus interconnection service has been used. So the top two ISOs are the Midwest ISO and SPP. So currently there are 4,000 megawatts of SIS capacity under review and 11 projects in the study phase with 30 additional surplus requests pending. And in the Southwest Power Pool, there was a recent project approved where there was 300 megawatts of surplus interconnection capacity available. It was an old thermal resource, and then they combined it with a storage resource, and it sailed through the interconnection process, meaning that there was no extra output that would go onto the system. And so basically within a year, everything was all wrapped up and ready to go. And then finally, so PJM was pretty slow. They for a while were pretty apprehensive about allowing SIS service to sail through the transmission study process. But what happened was they realized that because of data centers, because of the increase in demand, because of looking out and forecasting out into the future and not actually being sure you're going to meet your reliability requirement, they realized that you have all this space on the transmission grid or the highway system, and you have all these empty lanes, right? And so what PJM said is, okay, we got to get our act together, and we got to follow suit with SPP and MISO. So they also have decided to actually make things quite easy for developers to use surplus interconnection service. And what they estimate is it could unlock over 26 gigawatts of capacity before the 26-27 capacity auction. So I think that's the end of my presentation. I think that's it. That's it for me.
Thank you, Bob.
Okay.
We have one question about, so the question's like, what about ISO New England? So maybe you could speak to the relationship with ISO New England for a second.
Yeah. ISO New England is a bit late to the game, so that they're not as advanced as SPP or MISO or PJM, and that's because even though we have 845 that exists and it has to be used, it's either a function of not many people wanting to use it or New England wanting to just continue processing the same interconnection study requests as normal and not trying to do anything different. But they have some work to do in order to be as good as SPP or MISO.
Thank you for that. So I'm not seeing any other questions right now. We can always kind of come back to questions for you after other presentations too. So Erin, do you want to move to your presentation?
Yep, I'm happy to. Let me share my screen. All right. Are folks able to see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be able to talk to you about some of the benefits of surplus interconnection service today. As a brief bit of background about myself, I am a clean grid director at the Environmental League of Massachusetts. I'm new to ELM. I joined about 2 months ago, where I had come from the U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office. And while I was there, I focused on providing technical assistance on regional transmission planning in response to FERC Order 1920, as well as offering project management expertise to their CITAP ruling, or Coordinated Interagency Transmission Authorization and Permits Program. And so my background there really has given me a lot of exposure to transmission planning principles as they relate to interconnection service as well. I also previously served as a principal analyst at Sustainable Energy Advantage, where I focused on forecasting renewable energy credit prices in the New England market. So I have a lot of, it's nice to be at ELM and have those sort of two experiences be kind of united here. I was really brought to ELM to focus on effective clean energy integration and grid modernization in the Commonwealth. And so excited to be here to talk about the ways that we can do that via surplus interconnection service. I'll focus first on outlining sort of 3 of the benefits that we at ELM see for this service. And I want to first also start out by saying that we appreciate sort of consideration of allowing surplus interconnection service and encourage state decision makers to consider offering it as a capability in future clean energy procurements, including future rounds of 83C for offshore wind and 83E for storage. But first, just focusing on some of the benefits, really want to emphasize that surplus interconnection service enables resources to access some of the most cost-effective points of interconnection. I think it's also important to contextualize that the sort of more recent procurements required resources that sort of participate in the 83E storage procurement to connect at a capacity capability interconnection standard, or CCIS. And I bring that up because the CCIS is effectively a requirement for resources to participate in the capacity market in order to be eligible for procurements under the first round of 83E. And I bring this up because that capacity capability interconnection standard can create some unnecessary barriers to clean energy resources being able to leverage those procurements, which can drive up ratepayer costs. So by requiring that CCIS threshold, that capacity capability interconnection standard, it can unnecessarily prevent new resources from accessing those most cost-effective points of interconnection. And it can also prevent some of the lowest cost forms of electricity from being able to inject and get from where it is produced to where it is consumed. We can see some recent data points have shown that transmission can be a big component of rates increasing. And so particularly given the state's focus on energy affordability, it's just important to recognize that this is a really valuable service that can generate savings for ratepayers. So did want to emphasize that point. Then we go on to the second benefit that we see at ELM, which is sort of the energy reliability benefits of surplus interconnection service. And again, going back to that capability or the capacity capability interconnection standard, we view as sort of a barrier to preventing new resources from accessing some of the fastest methods from interconnecting. And I say that because as maybe could have been alluded to on the sort of first point on energy affordability, it's more cost effective to leverage the existing infrastructure than build new infrastructure. So if we use Baja's sort of analogy of, a highway, it's more cost effective to leverage the existing highway than to sort of build an entirely new highway. Same is true for the grid. And so when we look at energy reliability, creating a barrier to leveraging the surplus interconnection service is going to inherently force those resources to either pay costly upgrades or potentially even, do new transmission builds. And when you do that, those resources are forced to go through the siting and permitting process, which can, be lengthy. And it also forces them to go through lengthy interconnection queues. And while there are efforts to address both of those barriers, they nonetheless remain barriers today. And so when we look at being able to address reliability, making sure resources can come online as quickly as possible is crucial to keeping the lights on. And enabling resources to access surplus interconnection service is one way of doing that. Then when we talk about the clean energy and affordability or the clean energy and equity benefits, it's also important to highlight that surplus interconnection service is truly able to avoid those new builds. And when you do that, it does avoid some of those unnecessary land conversion or overburdening of disadvantaged communities. And I do think we at ELM view a yes and to meet our growing energy demands, we're going to need transmission build out. That said, anytime that we can leverage the existing grid more cost effectively to deliver those same services without sort of avoiding those land conversion sort of dynamics, I think we view that as an important tool that can and should be leveraged. So I'll move on to talk about a brief kind of refresher on some of the energy attributes versus energy components of the recent procurements. And so I bring this up because, as many of you know, the most recent 83E procurement is a procurement for energy attributes only, not energy. And so when we think about the energy system, we all know that generators like wind turbines produce electricity that is then transmitted to ratepayers. And so that's what you can see, in the bottom part of that diagram there. But I did want to focus some time on energy attributes. So as many of you know, in states like Massachusetts that have clean energy targets, clean energy resources can be thought of as producing those two types of services or value streams. So you see that electricity measured in megawatt hours at the bottom of the screen, and then you have the separate energy attributes in the form of RECs, CPECs, et cetera. So we know, one energy attribute in the form of one REC or one CPEC is produced for roughly every 1 megawatt hour of electricity generated. And so you can see that at the top part of the screen, these certificates prove that the electricity generated came from a clean energy resource. So I bring up sort of some of these fundamentals to highlight the ways that a capacity capability interconnection standard can create barriers for resources from accessing a surplus interconnection service. So again, the first round of the storage procurement is just a procurement for attributes only, not energy. And I know this was proposed as part of the administration's proposals for future resource procurements as part of the sort of resource solicitation program looking 3 years out. And we note that these procurements also include a requirement that resources be able to participate in the capacity market, which is sort of one of those types of energy markets that you see there on the screen. So just to elaborate, that capacity capability interconnection standard, by requiring resources to participate in the capacity market, which is the type of energy market, is effectively creating a requirement for both types of services, despite the fact that it's just a procurement for the energy attributes. So I bring this up because I think it creates an unnecessary barrier for two reasons. One, by procuring environmental attributes only, requiring capacity capability interconnection standard and capacity market participation is almost irrelevant in this case. That's not the service that the administration is procuring. And even if the state was procuring for energy, as it may, in future rounds, I think there appears to be a misunderstanding of concerns around some of the deliverability aspects. I think some of the concerns that have been circulating is that if two resources inject at the same point of interconnection, there could be congestion or over-injection. But I think our view is that this is a misunderstanding of how the market works. In practice, there's some, complexity associated with ensuring that at a given point of interconnection, there is not over-injection or stress on the grid. And further, economic dispatch would ensure that any given resource would be dispatched first, so long as it is the lowest possible cost. And we also further see that, recent FERC orders, including Order 845, as well as Order 2023, sort of mandate the inclusion of or require RTOs to explore offering a surplus interconnection service. And then we've seen that, as Baha kind of alluded to, implemented successfully in other regions. So I bring that up because there have been some concerns expressed about sort of the reliability concerns of enabling surplus interconnection service. And as we see in other market regions and in FERC orders, I think it's just a misunderstanding of how the market and sort of physics of the energy grid work. So I'll leave you kind of with those kind of key points in mind. And just, again, appreciate everyone's time here and opportunity to explore this topic. And, we look forward to opportunities to consider and encourage decision makers to allow for renewable energy resources to access surplus interconnection service in future clean energy procurements. And with that, my presentation is done. So I'll turn it to the next panelist.
Thanks, Erin. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. My first question is around, I guess, eligibility. So is a battery charged using fossil energy eligible for this program, or must it be charged from renewable sources?
I think that depends on the particulars of the procurement. Obviously, that's a great point. That should be addressed in the sort of, I would argue, in the procurement provisions.
Okay. And then this question is probably more for DOER than you, but I'll ask and see what you think. So the question is, what is the policy reason the new procurement policy is proposed as attribute only?
Sorry, attribute only?
Yeah.
So I think this was, again, one of the administration's efforts to achieve sort of energy affordability. So when you look at sort of the procurements, procuring for both environmental attributes and energy would cost more because you're procuring for quite literally two services instead of one. And so procuring for the environmental attributes only is a way for the administration to achieve some of the Commonwealth's clean energy procurement targets, while also producing a sort of a less expensive target for ratepayers. And those sort of developers could then sell their energy into the market, but then Massachusetts ratepayers aren't on the hook for those costs. So it's an energy affordability measure, in my opinion.
Right. Thank you. Randy, you mentioned that you might be able to speak more to the charging question. Do you want to talk on that?
Yeah. Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, everybody. So just to the charging question, which is a good one. So as Aaron noted, this procurement, the 83E procurement, is procuring for clean energy or environmental attributes. And what that means in practice is that they're procuring for clean peak credits. And the peak credits can only be realized. There are several different ways of realizing those. One of them is to have your battery co-located with a renewable resource. But the other way, one of the other ways, is to charge the battery during times of high renewable grid penetration. And the Clean Peak program has very specific hours in which that's laid out, so that while you're charging from the grid, it's at times when you have high renewable penetration, and then you're discharging during other hours where it's lower renewable penetration. And so while it's not one-to-one in terms of guaranteeing that you're getting renewable resource, the program is structured such that as more and more renewable resources go onto the grid, your battery is more and more charging with renewable energy. And so that's a way of incentivizing this program to make sure that you are not just charging from fossil, but you can still make it work as the grid evolves to become cleaner and cleaner.
Thank you, Randy, for that. That makes sense. We did have another question, I think almost as a follow-up for the battery question. Is a failure to perform when called upon to discharge the battery storage subject to fines?
So I think that was, again, if it was participating in the capacity market, it would be subject to fines if it did not sort of perform. Again, I think that there are some ISO New England market rules that also need to be sort of refined as this process goes forward. But that's a good question.
And then I had a question too, actually, going through your presentation. So you went through the benefits of surplus interconnection service, and those are very helpful and make a lot of sense to me. I was kind of curious, are there any drawbacks to surplus interconnection service? Like, I know it hasn't been adopted as much as it potentially can be in the state, and I was wondering if there's any reason for that beyond kind of just slowly getting us there, or are there any drawbacks?
Yeah, I think that the concerns, largely stem from some of the ISO New England market rules. And so just a brief bit of maybe additional background context. So some of the Massachusetts procurement effectively require a capacity level interconnection standard. So require participation in the capacity market to qualify for some of these procurements. On the flip side, in the ISO New England market rules, it effectively creates some barriers for renewable energy resources from accessing surplus interconnection service unless the resource is proven to be sort of continuously available. So I think some of the complexities and sort of, I wouldn't call them drawbacks, but I would say that there are some complexities that do need to be addressed in the ISO New England tariff to fully leverage this. So I think, we approach this as making sure there's sort of two states of play. There's sort of making sure that this is addressed at the state level. And there are market reforms that ISO New England would need to consider. sort of making sure that at any given individual point of interconnection that, there's some market complexities with making sure that no resource is able to inject both at the same time or create sort of voltage violations. I know that there's also sort of equity considerations with queue jumping, which again, this is not queue jumping, but it's something that would need to be addressed in the ISO New England tariff, which is, the ISO New England queues are quite lengthy. And so if resources are able to leverage some of these sort of existing points of interconnection, you would need to address how that is treated for the other folks that are in line for the queue. And if these resource points would need to be made available to sort of like a wider array of audiences sort of first. So I would not say drawbacks, I would say market complexities, but there are market complexities with case studies in other RTOs that have implemented this effectively that ISO New England can look to implement.
Right, thank you. That's helpful. Great. Well, we did have one more question just come in. Is additional legislative action needed to leverage SIS, or does the executive have the authority it needs?
I think it depends on what ends up being adopted as it relates to future procurements. I know that the legislature has a role in dictating what resources are procured. I know that there's language in the affordability bill to effectively do something called the resource solicitation plan to sort of outline resource needs over the next 3 years. And once that plan is approved, again, once affordability bill is passed and that language is implemented, I think that language is intended to understand what resources are needed and then what provisions are associated with those future procurements. So it's a long, rambly way of saying kind of. I think part of the reason we wanted to do this panel is to just sort of have these conversations with the decision makers, because I think there's a role for the legislature and there's a role for some of the sort of folks at DOER and DPU as well.
So actually, our next question is kind of a similar sort of question related to that. Is there any coordination between, say, utility planners, DPU, DOER, legislator, ISO New England that could happen to more rapidly accommodate SIS?
Yeah, I think these conversations are ongoing. ELM, quite candidly had filed comments in the latest sort of draft for round 1 of 83E for storage to encourage the DPU and the independent evaluator to consider SIS. And I think the consensus was there's some just open questions and complexities that warrant a little bit more investigation. And so it wasn't included in round 1, but it's been left open for inclusion in future rounds. And so I bring that up because some of the reasons given for not including it this round included addressing some of those uncertainties and complexities. So, we've already seen openness to enabling SIS in future rounds. So I think that the stage is being set now. And so, the current round 1 is expected to be issued by the end of July. The next round will be issued July of next year. And so I think this next year and having these conversations is what's going to influence how it is incorporated and considered. We've had conversations with DOER and with in our public comments to DPU. So I think that coordination is already happening. But the more some of the decision makers hear from folks on this call, from folks like us on the panel, I think will go a long way for next rounds.
Right, thank you. And then one last question for now. So you mentioned other ISOs or RTOs that have kind of successfully changed tariffs for SIS. So I guess the question is, which of those ISOs or RTOs do you recommend kind of looking to that have successfully changed the tariff for SIS? And are you aware of ISO New England looking into this now?
Yeah, so I would look to PJM. I think they similarly had some barriers to enabling resources to access surplus interconnection and did recently reform their tariff. I believe, and again, my recollection is a little fuzzy, so excuse me if I misspeak. I think the issue in PJM was concern over leveraging surplus interconnection capacities triggering significant upgrades to the grid and what constituted a significant upgrade to ensure that, again, this was in form of sort of either A, queue jumping, or B, creating the conditions that would require a more significant upgrade. So that's my understanding, but please take that with a grain of salt. And as far as ISO New England goes, I will admit ELM is not a NEPOOL member, but I know we have several colleagues that are NEPOOL members that are pushing ISO New England to include this in their 2026 annual work plan. It's to be determined whether that is included.
Thank you. Will, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, thank you. Just for clarification, ISO New England does actually have it included in its tariff. And so the issue isn't so much not ISO New England. Now, as Erin was talking about, there are room for improvements, and I think that's what she was speaking to, but there already is, existing, it's already existing in the tariff.
Yes, it is in the tariff, but I think the point I'm trying to stress is there are barriers to renewable energy resources from being able to leverage that service.
That's correct. That's correct.
All right. So with that, thank you, Erin. No promises we won't call on you again for more questions, but really appreciate answering the questions for now. And we will hand it over to, I think it's between Charlie and Will for the last two speakers. So whichever one of you is going to start off.
I don't know. Go ahead, Will. If you're ready, happy to go.
Yeah, no, I can go through. Yeah. Let me share.
Okay.
Okay, well, good morning, and I appreciate the time to speak with you today. As many of you know, I work for JERA Americas. My name is William Ziff. I'm Vice President of Development, and I've spent a lot of time working on the situation at Canal, or the transition of Canal to compete in a low carbon economy. For those of you who are unfamiliar with JERA Americas is a U.S. subsidiary of a Japanese power generator. JERA is committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050, along with the Japanese government, and such is our commitment. Sorry about that. All right, so as many of you know, that Canal facility is one of the case study facilities. And a quick overview of the Canal generation assets they're located in Sandwich, Massachusetts, and the site has a total capacity of about 1,400 megawatts. And this is interconnected to the southeastern Massachusetts network at 35 kV. Units 1 and 2 are older fossil units, while Unit 3 is a newer flexible dual fuel unit. The site has historically played a key role in grid reliability, especially during critical events like Winter Storm Elliott and this week's heat wave. We're going to focus on Units 1 and 2 for the rest of the presentation, as they have an average capacity factor that is quite low, under 2%, and that represents an underutilized asset as we see it, and a good candidate for SIS. So Massachusetts really faces two major challenges. The first is rising demand from electrification, and also, reliability risks during extreme weather events. Now, the solution, of course, is to, apply a low carbon solution to provide the extra generation. And what that means, and the policies that they've taken, is to issue RFPs that are central to the clean energy strategy. And the reason is because they bridge the economic gap for zero carbon solutions. But the current rules require new infrastructure, even when existing assets could be shared. As Erin has already pointed out, the RPS core objective is to acquire zero carbon energy, yet they require projects to secure new capacity level rights, CCIS, which will do nothing to increase actual renewable output. It does slow down the process, and it does saddle ratepayers with avoidable and significant cost. As we can see, it's up to $250 per kW or kilowatt. And as you know, that can affect a cost for a 550 megawatt battery storage. It can increase the cost by 138 million. For an 800 megawatt offshore wind, it goes up to 200 million. Now, that just doesn't only burden the ratepayers with the new build capital costs, but it also means that the ratepayer has to fund ongoing maintenance for two facilities when a shared one could be used. And these rules exist in the RFP. As mentioned before, there are certain barriers in the tariff, but the tariff does allow for this at this time. And if it weren't for these limitations that exist, again, only in the RFPs, we believe that we could successfully implement an SIS solution, again, sharing the resources that already exist. On this slide, what we see here, and I want to give reference to the slides that I've cut below from a previous presentation. It was from the Decarbonizing the Peak Working Meeting 1 in November 2024, and the information was produced by E3. But the key thing here is we have 89 fossil power plants across New England, and they operate as peaking units. And because of the low capacity factor of these units, while all may not be great sites, many will be sites for SIS. And the key takeaway here is, although we focus on Canal because we own it, the application for renewable penetration, can apply to many, many sites in New England as well as in Massachusetts. Massachusetts peaker plants comprise 15% of the region's total resource capacity. So making a dent in the Massachusetts or allowing the facilities in the Massachusetts is a significant impact, not just to Massachusetts, but also New England in general. So how does SIS work? We get a lot of these questions, and I think it's important to understand, once again, that Canal units currently only operate during the extreme peak demands. I think in the previous working session on battery storage, it was highlighted that Canal 1 and 2 offer extended periods, and that's when they run, but they're very limited. Again, less than 2% occurred over the last 4 years. And you can see on the graph on the right, that's how the capacity factor has trended over time. Beginning in 2000, it was much more. It was highly used, around 50% capacity factor, and again has decreased down here, or down since that time. And what that means is there's this available or underutilized or idle capacity that is up to 97%. The other thing is these are CCS qualified assets. So a clean energy facility connecting to this through SIS to these existing assets can achieve the same practical deliverability as a project with its own CCIS rights. And so there really isn't a compromise in reliability, but there is the advantage of reduced project cost. And there is the advantage of an accelerated time frame to get new green energy sources to market. Another question that we get about how this works is based on if you have two resources, one thermal and one renewable or zero carbon, how do they operate? And I think it needs to be understood that ISO dispatches based on cost, not on interconnection type. And this is independent of SIS. And so the dispatch priority is based on the cost of the particular unit to dispatch. And the clean energy resources are consistently low cost. As renewable like solar and wind offer a zero cost of generation. When the wind blows, that's all there needs to be. For BESS, there's a little bit of an operational cost. You have to charge and discharge. But when we see like a unit like Canal, which operates mostly on oil, we see about $150. And you can see in the graph on the lower right, the relative cost advantage. And so because ISO New England always dispatches the lower cost, zero is always going to beat fuel plus an operation expense. And so that's how the decision is going to be made. And so what it ends up being is that the thermal units serve as a backup, not the primary. And it addresses one of the critical concerns with intermittent resources like wind. What happens when the wind isn't available or the solar isn't available? Well, the answer is the thermal unit at the same interconnection point is available, and it can firm up and be there in the absence of this low, zero energy. SIS does preserve the market fairness and reliability. As I mentioned before, it will dispatch, similar in the same fashion as the traditional assets. And again, it does capture idle resources. These resources are sitting available, in our case, 90% of the time. So, as we see, what needs to happen is really we need to update the overly tight requirements of the RFPs. We see that as the key limiting factor. Again, RFPs are the solution that the state has is looking towards to transition to a low carbon economy. And these RFP restrictions prevent an SIS project from being a conforming bid or being able to participate. The requirements don't match the procurement or legislative goals. And as Aaron had mentioned, for the recent 83E, environmental attributes is all that's being required, not capacity, not the need for these additional CCIS facilities. And so it's overly burdensome and doesn't bring anything to what the RFP is requesting, environmental attributes. And as mentioned, SIS still meets the reliability and deliverability standards as a CCIS asset. And what we're basically proposing here is not to force SIS solution. We're really just asking that SIS included to be part of the competitive framework. We just want SIS projects to compete with everything else. It doesn't force the state to select an SIS-based project. It simply lets them compete, giving decision makers the flexibility to choose the best overall option based on cost, reliability, and system efficiencies. And so what we suggest is there's an opportunity with the energy affordability bill in Massachusetts, and that within that bill, we could introduce legislation, that would remove these barriers. And so that's our presentation.
Thank you, Will. We did have one question. If you go to your last slide, actually, when you talk about RFPs, could you just be specific what RFPs you're talking about?
Yeah, I'll let Randy, my colleague, chime in here, but we're specifically for the battery section 83E, and then I believe for offshore wind, it's 83. Is it C? Randy, do you want to step in so I don't get over my skis?
Yep, 83C.
Okay, thank you.
Now, I think the other thing to note is it's consistent. This barrier language has been consistently in all these RFPs, and it's not just limited to Massachusetts RFPs. It also extends to Connecticut and others in the region. And what we found is this language really showed up around 2015 timeframe. And the significance of that is FERC order for SIS didn't occur until 2019. So it's understandable why this language wasn't a language allowing for SIS wasn't in the original documents. That's completely understandable because it didn't even exist until 2019. And so, really what we're asking is it's time to revisit it with this new, under the new current situation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Charlie, did you have a presentation or something to add?
Yeah, I'll be brief. And I think I'll have to request sharing.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to not share anymore. Sorry. Let me do this. How's that? There we go.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Charlie McClelland. I'm Director of Transmission with Long Road Energy. I've been supporting Long Road's interconnection activities throughout the New England region for the last about 10 years. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the various levels of interconnection service in not only ICE New England, but in ISOs and RTOs throughout the US. Appreciate the opportunity to follow presentations here this morning. Most of what I'll say is a recap of what has already been said, with specific focus on the capacity capability interconnection standard and some of the implications for the ISO study process. So I'll just dive right in here. So Long Road, I'll start by saying Long Road supports the inclusion of surplus interconnection service for 83E resources. And one of the reasons is because, in our view, CCIS is an impediment to procuring the most cost-effective resources that us developers are bringing to the market. And that's going to have an implication for how effective those resources are at displacing fossil fuels and adding environmental benefits to the system. So that's sort of the underlying thesis here. So I'll go through our points, but the overarching theme here is that CCIS excludes potentially viable projects. It limits the points of interconnection that we can bring projects to cost effectively. It adds complexity and uncertainty into the 83E procurement process by narrowing the pool of projects that could economically deliver those benefits. For projects in the queue, and there are lots of storage projects in the queue without forward capacity studies or CCIS studies, we face a lot of uncertainty around what our upgrades are going to be, and aren't going to understand what our CCIS upgrades would be until next year. It's well after the 83E bid contracting timeline, which is targeting a March 2026 contract execution date. So basically, if you have a project in the queue today, it's going to participate in the transitional CNR group in the fall. You're not going to understand what your upgrades are until next summer. So that's a problem. Secondly, we look at CCIS as really redundant for the purposes of 83E because the Clean Peak standard has been designed to incent projects to dispatch during peak grid reliability hours, during peak demand windows every day. So the structure of the CPS already, I guess, motivates projects to deliver system benefits when they're needed most. And secondly, projects that interconnect under the CCIS standard and are granted CNR service don't necessarily get any dispatch priority over projects with just regular NR or sort of energy-only resource interconnection service during times of stress conditions, save for a very few reliability, what do you call it, OP4, OP7 extreme events when capacities resources do have priority dispatch. Ordinarily, because the ISO is a nodal market that dispatches a particular resource, and therefore its ability to offer environmental benefits is really based on the project's offer price. That was a point numerous folks have brought up this morning. And our ability to offer the lowest offer price into the market is really going to be a function of how cost effectively we can build our project and interconnect it with the grid. And the CCIS effectively introduces additional costs for us to bring that project to market. So this third bullet, CCIS unnecessarily overcomplicates the selection process. What we would like to propose for future procurements is that the DOER require a lower level of interconnection service, specifically network capability interconnections standard. Network resource interconnection service, which is under the NCIS or the Network Capability Interconnection Standard. And we believe NCIS is a more appropriate interconnection standard to support 83E objectives. And what I've done here is I've highlighted a few statements from DOER's June 18th, 2025 RFI, because we're not sure that DOER's intent is fully, I guess CCIS really fulfills DOER's intent. And so I highlight just a few statements here. DOER says, by requiring CCIS transmission and any distribution upgrade costs driven by resource interconnection are included in the cost of the new resource, enabling apples to apples comparison of various bids. Wanted to make the clarification that CCIS isn't necessary to identify costs driven by resource interconnection, but rather deliverability. So that NCIS standard that I brought up on the last slide, that is the standard that identifies costs for a resource's interconnection. And so when you look at the resources that are in the queue, everything is going to be studied under the NCIS to begin with. And so there is already a uniform set of studies to compare projects, sort of apples to apples, so to speak. Yeah, and that gets at point two, which is DOER says DOER and distribution companies elected to require CCIS in round one based on the screening analysis that projects eligible for round one sought or seeking CNR interconnection service. Yeah, just to restate that, the ISO New England already evaluates all projects under the NCIS. Only projects requesting CNR are studied under the CCIS. And then finally, DOER and the distribution companies determined it was appropriate to incorporate the CCIS requirement due to the timing constraints and associated complexities with evaluating multiple levels of interconnection service. Yeah, again, by default, the ISO is already going to study the projects in the queue under the network capability interconnection standard. So adding the CCIS requirement is just a further level of complexity that makes it harder for developers to anticipate our costs ahead of actually getting those study results, which again won't be until next year. So I did include a slide just to refresh on definitions between CCIS and NCIS, which have been thrown around these acronyms here for the last few minutes. But that's really my presentation. And yeah, happy to take any questions and appreciate the opportunity to present here.
Thank you, Charlie and Will, for presenting on the developer point of view. Don't have any questions currently. I just give it a minute. Alrighty, so with that, I'll wrap up early. Thank you very much to our panelists here today, speaking on surplus interconnection service, and I think that's all we have for you. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.